get through and choose one of your images. Let's see, I'm just gonna move these ones off to the side. You should be able to see my screen. I have picked elderly guy in a cool hat. Ideally, you don't need to have the text on screen. That's kind of there for me, and it's kind of there so you kind of can remember what we're going to be doing. But in general, I would like you guys to just start with making a new layer once you're in Photoshop. So I'm going to be kind of doing this in various orders. Ideally, you'll have, if you're here in class, you'll have Photoshop on your tablet, and you'll have me on Zoom. This is probably the best way to go about it. Let's see how it goes. Okay, anyone, are we feeling all good? Do we need a couple extra minutes? Maybe a couple extra minutes? Your keyboard's being weird. Oh, Paige, what do you remember what you did to fix that? Or did you fix that? Also, I heard a voice. No voice? No voice? We're good. Okay. Okay, we're going to just give it a minute. This is the normal setup part. Thank you guys who arrived early. Okay, let's see how we are doing. Anyone not able to download brushes or install them or find the place I'm talking about? Excellent. Excellent. You guys have navigated despite my instructions. Oh, I actually asked someone to unmute, but you can ignore that. That was me trying to mute you. If you have just jumped onto Zoom, please mute yourself. Thank you. We should be good. Okay, I'm going to jump into it. You should be able to have a look and see what I'm doing, kind of follow along. Hopefully there's no echoing. People who are online, if there is horrible echoing, please tell us, because it might mean that someone's got their mic off, mic on, we'll see. Okay, cool. So hopefully you have chosen your image from the collection. You can use a different one, but it's much easier to use one of these for now, simply because they already exist and you don't need to think too much about it. So again, you can use different brushes. I have loaded up the ones that I tend to use here. Mine look like this currently because I have made it so you can see what the brush tips look like. Plenty of people use different methods, doesn't matter. But if you are looking at what I'm clicking and you're not sure what where that is, make sure that brush tip is visible in the settings. Okay, so I like to use this one here as my sketching brush for the last couple months. Yeah, they should be able to be imported. The little arrow next to the brushes, down to import brushes, and then you can select them from your downloads. They should load in. Yeah, excellent. Okay, cool. So as a starting point, we've got our reference. We just want to start like doing some really rough sketching, just putting it down the page. It's not going to be perfect. I like to just start with the sort of, let me just make my brush a bit bigger, the kind of rough shape of the head. So thinking big blocky shapes, you're trying to break the form down. You're not worrying about where the eyes are. You're trying to block out, okay, here's where the head roughly is. Here is the shape of the jaw. Here is the sort of center line of the face. So you're welcome to follow along with me at this point. You're also welcome to just watch if you find that more useful. But in general, it's a workshop. It's good to be doing things as well. So I'm also breaking down the shapes of, say, the clothing at this point. So I'm not trying to guess where his shoulders are. I'm just going, okay, I can see from this photo, they are roughly sort of around here. I'm going to sort of like try and chuck in the eye line like this. I'm going to block in the rough shape of where his hat is. Again, these are super rough. I'm being quite light and sketchy. I'm not trying to make it look perfect. At this point, it's useful just to get a general idea of if things are working. I like to start like kind of adding small amounts of detail with things like ears, where They are quite a large part of the shape of the face, but we're not worrying about kind of zooming in at this stage. We are keeping things nice and zoomed out. We can see the entire canvas, and we are just trying to block in these sort of very general rough ideas of where things are. So some people like to use quite a large brush at this stage. Hello, jump on a computer and open up the Zoom link, and in the sign up for the clinics page, you'll be able to see a link to like a tiny URL, and you can download a brush set and some photos from that, and just like open those and you'll be good. If you need help, I will kind of walk around in a couple minutes and just see how people are going. At this stage, we're going to spend only about 5 minutes or so doing a little sketch like this, because we want to jump into other things quite fast. So now I'm just going to start sort of blocking in, where are his eyes? So I'm thinking, okay, his eyes are kind of roughly here. Again, we're trying to go for general shapes. We're not trying to draw the eyes as necessarily as eyes. We're just trying to get a sense of how they are sort of positioned on the face. We're not worrying about the expression necessarily. I find it useful to think about things in terms of these big blocky shapes, but also to think about shadows as kind of physical kind of areas. So I might block in, say, the shape of the shadows around the corners of his nose here, just as much as I'm blocking in the actual shape of the nose itself. So doing this is something you might kind of recognize if you have done oil painting before. As somebody who has done a very small amount of oil painting, I am certainly not teaching a sort of a extremely recognizable version of it, but in general, you kind of want to think about these shadows. So for instance, on this guy here, we have these quite deep shadows at the corner of his mouth and his face, and we can start to see kind of like how these help form the shape of the face by sort of blocking them in on our sketch. So you also might have heard of the idea of kind of the planes of the face. So that's often what we are trying to think about as well. Thinking about where does the face sort of break up into, say, the front facing area. So I'm sketching on my guy here just to kind of show I'm sort of like breaking up this sort of front planes versus the sort of side planes off where it's sort of like his cheek connects to his ear. So everyone does things in quite different ways. So I'm really focusing on trying to sort of block out some of these shadows as well. So I'm thinking about the shadows for my guy's hat, for instance. You guys might have chosen different images. That's totally fine. You'll have different things you're looking for when it comes to how you present your character, your figure here. You might find that your guy looks not that much like what we're going for. You might find you're able to get quite a close approximation. Either is fine. So once I have this very rough shape of my figure here, I might start going in and kind of blocking out a few more details. So I have this nice fast sketch of my guy. He looks a little more angry than his photo. I've also done a little bit of exaggeration by accident, like I've made his nose a bit bigger than it is in his photo. That's fine. I could go in and fix these, or I could keep them as is. So one tool that I find quite useful at this stage in particular is the lasso tool. So in the kind of menu where you can select things off to the left-hand side, the lasso tool is sometimes under the kind of polygonal lasso tool or something instead, but this lets you select areas on the page and manipulate them by, say, resizing them or playing around with the rotation, things like that. And so maybe I'm going to do that to resize his eyes a little bit because I've made them a little too big. So at this point, I have a rough idea of what he looks like. Maybe I want to start exaggerating him a little bit. So I've got this version. I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to pick a darker color just so I can see it clearly on top of my red color. If you have started sketching in black or something, that's totally fine. Remember that you can change the color of your of any layer just by kind of using the image adjustment saturation tool. And this is a quick way to be like, I want a paler image, or I want it to be green or blue, something like that. Doesn't matter. I'm leaving mine as red for now. And I'm going to go in, maybe make my sketch a bit transparent. And I'm just going to start blocking out a couple more details of my guy. So maybe I'm going to think about his eyes. I'm going to still be kind of keeping in mind where these big shadows are, what it is that is happening with these shadows. Think about if the character has wrinkles on their face, things like that. How are you treating these as these kind of really defined shapes? So everyone's going to have quite different looking sort of ways of going about this. You also might find that you hate the tool that I'm using and you want to use a different brush entirely. Doesn't matter, that's totally fine. The reason I got you guys to download my brushes is so that you would not spend too much time thinking about brushes. Not because mine are innately better in any way. They're also not mine. I just stole them off the internet from various people over the years. So kudos to whoever actually made these brushes. I don't know who they are. They did a great job. So as I'm doing this, I'm just refining things a little bit. I'm not worrying too much about making things looking perfect at this stage. But this is a chance for me to go in and be like, okay, maybe I'm going to harden up sort of some of the shapes around the ear here. I'm going to enhance the shape of his jowls and his chin. I really want to sort of have the kind of square blocky nature of his head coming through. So I'm still using quite loose shapes and loose lines here. Some people like to use this stage to tighten things up a bit. It's kind of a personal choice thing, in my opinion. But none of these are lines worth erasing unless I make an awful mistake. And so in general, I like to try and avoid undoing or erasing things as much as possible. It's particularly at this stage when it is somewhat less important. So a lot of these lines, they're going to be super sketchy, but none of them are going to make it to the final product. So I have my guy. I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes, and I'm going to walk around and just check how you're doing, answer any questions, that sort of thing. You're just trying to get him to this sort of point. You want to be constantly looking back at your reference material. If you don't know what you're drawing, if you don't know if something's working, look back at your photo. Try actually observe, okay, what's going on here? So for instance, with my guy, I've given him a sort of downturned mouth in the center when his mouth is actually quite straight. So I'm just going to go in and edit this and sort of fix this up and try and match his expression a little more accurately. You are welcome to decide you want to do something else with the character's expression or something like that, but the more you make up, the harder it gets. So when you're using reference, if you can afford to, at least at this stage, kind of stay quite close to the reference, it is often worthwhile. So I'm just going to come around, see how you guys are doing, just aiming to kind of get it to the point where we have a rough approximation of the features. You might want to start exaggerating things like, okay, let's give him bigger eyes. Let's really enhance the square blocky nature of his face, that sort of thing. Maybe you're like me and you always make one eye too big or slightly weirdly placed or something like that. Again, there's not an incorrect way to do things. Use the kind of erase tool if you need to. So I'm doing this on a Mac. I usually do it on a PC. If you see me make weird errors, blame that. Okay, I'm gonna have a little quick walk around, see how guys are doing. If you have questions, please ask. Okay, where is how do you get to the yeah, got it. Got it. Okay. Download. Photoshop. I love the look at the screen. So once it's open, you can just go to downloads and open this PSD and load it from that's looking good. Yeah. Yeah, so pull Photoshop down. Sign it to the email. Okay. Get rid of trying to bring up messy email and if you can't use the whole. That's a good one. Fast and ugly is totally fine. I do a lot of it's a fast ugly sketch and I just make it happen and then like I can move that into it later on. Yeah. That's kind of fun. Many of them are good and only some are not. Keep big sort of like motions. Don't worry about making it perfect at this point. Like your sketch there is looking really good. You don't need to make it 100% perfect and polished. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if you feel like you've got a general impression, then I'm going to come back to the computer. Okay. So this was the step number one, kind of breaking into shapes, nice and fast and rough. So yeah, we've done a little bit of exaggeration or distortion or styling if you kind of want that. Again, that's kind of up to you. A lot of you guys will have an idea of the way you like to draw or the way you like to go about things. I'm keeping mine relatively close to what we've got going on here, but I've kind of exaggerated a few features slightly. That's kind of like something that is very much personal choice. So I have two layers here. I'm going to hide the red one. That was my very first sketch layer. It doesn't really matter if you have done things on one layer. You just need one layer open, and then you want to make another Photoshop layer underneath that, so that when we draw, it is underneath your sketch layer. This is again just to make things nice and easy. It is kind of your call how you do this. Some people like to use a layer on top, but this works better for me. So what I recommend doing now is going to the brush menu and picking a nice big brush. So I have 3 brushes here that are good for this. One of them is the one that is set to 90 and it's a line. You can adjust the sizes. I'm just telling you how to find these brushes. So it's this one here, and it makes sort of like this kind of painterly effect. I also have, you can delete it if you want. This one here, which is a little more sort of like paintbrush-like, and I have my current favorite, I believe, which is this one here, which has sort of a textural effect. All very similar in general in how they apply things. You can use the hard round default brush for this. It doesn't matter. I also have this one, which I like for sort of like painting, and which is what I'm going to use now. So I like to start with a nice big brush. So on the canvas, I've given you guys a kind of 300 plus size brush is actually quite good. You're going to be putting down some really rough, blocky, fast sorts of shapes. You can, if you want, use the eyedropper tool, which is on a Mac, holding down Option. On a Windows, it's holding down Control, I think.
Pretty sure, yeah.
Pretty sure I actually use Windows, but I don't look at the keyboard when I do this, which will allow you to select colors if you want from your photograph. I do recommend trying to eyeball it in the color panel menu, since that can sometimes give you a bit of a better result. For this guy here, I'm trying to figure out kind of like, okay, what is a general sort of approximate skin tone for him when it comes to just sort of laying down these, like what his base color is. So I'm not thinking about what color he is in the shadows right now. I'm just trying to get a sense of what's happening in sort of the big chunks of him. So I'm also doing this just for his clothing. His clothing is blackish, grayish. I'm not thinking about pattern. I just want to start putting down big chunks of color. Nice, big, ugly. His hat is a slightly lighter gray, let's say. So it doesn't matter if you're going over the lines, that's perfectly fine. All this stuff, you can go and clean it up later. You're just trying to build up a general sense of color at this stage. Once you have him here, so some people do the thing where you have different sort of like elements on different layers. So maybe the hat layer would be colored on an entirely different layer, so that I can easily then go to, say, image adjustments and saturation and color the hat differently if I wanted to. I'm not going to do that this time because I'm going to go through this all pretty fast, but it's definitely an option. It can also be quite useful if you're working on larger pictures. So in general, it's good practice to keep your differently colored segments like skin color on a nice skin color layer. But as long as all of your colors are, you know, like just in a way where they make sense side by side, you'll be fine. So now I have this here. I can go back and start thinking about how I've put in these sort of shadows earlier. So there's two ways you can go about it. I will show you what I think is like the fast way when it comes to working digitally. So that's going to be making a new layer on top of my color layer, right-clicking on it, and going to create clipping mask. So if you haven't met a clipping mask before, it just means that when I draw on a clipping mask, you are now going to get everything that I draw stays within that shape, which is nice and handy. And I want to start putting down some shadows to start with. So the most useful way to do shadows in most settings, most of the time, is changing your blend mode to multiply. So if you look at my screen, I'm going to where it currently says normal while I have my blend mode selected. And I can just sort of hover my mouse down this list. Multiply is the one that is often used to easily apply shadows. Sometimes things like overlay might be used as well, or darker color. It's kind of up to the individual artist. Everyone does things differently. I personally find that multiply really works for me. So when I'm putting down shadows, shadows in kind of basic lighting are often roughly sort of a bluey grayish color. You don't actually want to be using things in this sort of dark segment. You want to be staying up here in the sort of like light but gray sort of area if you're going for this. This will allow you to sort of apply shadows that start to kind of make sense with basic ideas of lighting. So I'm going in, I'm still using a really big brush and I'm not zooming in. It's really important to not be zooming in at this stage. Keep working with really big brushes, keep working with big shapes. So I'm blocking in some of these shadows that I identified earlier. I'm not doing this in a beautiful way. I'm just trying to get a sense of what's happening. And sometimes that means I just sort of go over areas quite messily. I go over them quite fast, just to sort of start seeing what's happening. I might use a slightly lighter color of gray to kind of like help give a sense of what's happening on the side of his face. Or I might decide that's not quite working and lighten that a bit. And so this might be sort of my first pass of just laying down some shadows. It's going to work differently for everyone. So in this case, this guy, the photo I'm looking at, it has quite dark shadows. So maybe I want to make a second multiply layer and do the same thing. This time, letting those shadows go a bit darker. Maybe I'm working with a darker color originally. Maybe I'm going to pick a slightly warmer color because as we can see from the photograph here, these shadows on this guy are not terribly cold in terms of the lighting. You guys will have your own photos that you're looking at and working from. Those will have sort of different applications of light and shadow and kind of what color the light source is. Yes.
What brush are you using to do all your coloring?
I'm using currently the one that's just 91, but you can use pretty much anything in this selection and it'll be fine.
And you've just scaled it up?
Yep, no, just working nice and big. Between like 150 to 300 is good. You want to work as big as you possibly can, in my experience. Just because working big means you're getting these big, broad areas of color in nice and fast. It is not trying to be perfect with these brush strokes. It is trying to give an approximation of what you're after. So sometimes when you are doing things like this, there's a temptation to start zooming in, being like, okay, I'm gonna define his eyeball. I'm gonna go in and really polish that thing. You want to avoid that as long as humanly possible, in my experience. So as I'm doing this, you know, I can go through and I can lower the opacity on some of these layers to make, say, the shadows darker or lighter. I could use image and adjustments and hue saturation to, say, darken the shadows manually as well, or to change their color. So if I wanted all of his shadows to be much warmer, I could just start playing around with that here. As it is, I'm trying to sort of match this photo a little bit, but I'm not necessarily sticking to it terribly well. So I'm sort of finding somewhere in between. So currently I have a sense of sort of shadows on his face, and I'd like to sort of start bringing in a sense of light. So in this case, I'm now thinking about where on his face is the light hitting. A lot of the photos I've given you guys have a very diffuse sense of light. So there's not a single strong, sharp light source. I would like my pen to work now. I would like my pen to work. Oh, excellent. There we go. Okay. So the light is a little bit light, a little bit sort of like glowy. It is not extremely clear. For this, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm making a new clipping mask. It's over top of my color layer. And I can start painting on light effects. So light effects outdoors are often kind of a grayish, yellowish color, very pale. If I just start painting without any kind of blend mode on, sometimes I'll do this. I can just sort of start painting in these lights wherever I'm seeing them. So in this case, it's going to be kind of overblown at first, but maybe I want to go in and just get a sense of where these lights are on his face, on his features. You know, in this case, one side of his face is a little bit more in shadow than the other, so the light is not reaching it as much. His hat has a little bit of light on it, on the brim here. I'm making my brush as big as I possibly can to do a lot of these broad strokes. So I can either work with things like this, or I could say take this into a soft light layer. And as you play around with blend modes, you'll see that they all have different functions. They all have different ways they can be applied. Overlay and soft light are both really good when it comes to applying light in general. I'm going to go with soft light. It is a little less harsh. So I have an approximation of my guy here. I have an idea of what I'm going for. I am going to move through this thing quite fast, by the way, because we have only an hour for this. So it's okay if you are not like 100% keeping up or anything. It's always going to be a little fast. So now what I've got is if I hide my shadow and light layers, I have my really default looking guy here who I'm working on. So I want to go back and select that color layer and I want to start painting on that color layer again underneath these light and shadow effects I've now got. So if I look at my photo of my guy, I'm like, okay, there is a lot of sort of areas of warmth and redness that I'm missing out on. So I've got a brush, it looks like this, and I'm just using this at like quite high saturation to just try and add in little touches of warmth to his face, to his features. Again, I'm looking back at that reference photo a lot. I'm trying to kind of think about where do I want these sort of lights and shadows to go. I'm not worried about going over the edges. I can always go back and erase stuff later. I can go back and add a background later, that's fine. I also might want to think about how the bottom half of his face is a little less saturated. So maybe if I just sort of play around with adding a slight sort of bluish grayish tinge here to kind of help give that sense of what's happening with his stubble. Again, all of these, they're going to be super rough. I'm doing these little tiny movements with my brush. I'm not going extremely fierce with this. And I'm also, if I need to be, I am using the eyedropper tool as I go along. So at this point, let's say I have an approximation of my guy, and I want to start actually properly painting into him. Oh, firstly, I'm going to give him his eye color, silly me. So eyes aren't white, and you don't generally want them to be white. You want them to be kind of either grayish, bluish, or grayish, pinkish for the whites of the eyes. It depends on the person. This guy kind of has a sort of like warmer, sort of like pinkish sort of tone to his eyes. A lot of people do, and I'm just going to add in the darks. Okay, that helps him. Okay, so I'm now going to make a new layer on top of all of these. And in this case, I am really focusing on his face. And I'm going to see if I can just start painting into this. So at this point, I'm still working with big brushes. I don't want to go small. I don't want to have very fiddly things where I'm zooming in. I want to stay zoomed out as long as I possibly can. So I'm using the eyedropper tool to basically pick up colors and smear them around. So I'm doing this by, firstly, I'm putting my painting layer that I'm starting on here on top of my line art layer so that I'm painting over top of my line art as I do this, by the way. So I just sort of start using this to block in shapes. You can use pretty much any of the brushes I've got there for this. They all have different effects, and they all appear to have slightly different effects on a Mac, which is fun and a little annoying of them. So a lot of brushes, you will end up sort of playing around with them, finding out what works best for you through experimentation. And what works for someone else may not be how you like to work. So as I'm doing this, I am doing a lot of really big movements where I'm just trying to block in these shapes. My brushes are all kind of semi-transparent, and they're all trying to mimic traditional painting brushes, because that's sort of how this is sort of like trying to mimic a sort of oil painting style almost. It is not always necessarily successful. It is obviously just not going to be the same as working with true oils, but we can start to get an approximation of the effect as we're doing this. So I'm trying to look at where the big movements of light and shadow fall. I'm not trying to put in tiny individual wrinkles. I'm using kind of the way that the brushes have a sense of texture to them to help build up whatever I'm doing with sort of these broad shapes of the character. And I'm using the eyedropper tool pretty much every second or third stroke in order to just get just a good sort of sense of what colors I'm using around the space. So as I'm doing this, maybe I'm going to start defining the shape of the nose like I'm doing here by having a slightly sort of darker edge to it. So I'm still looking at the reference photo. I'm seeing how the light and shadow on that is applied. And I'm just thinking about where is the light source? Where does the light come from? How does it fall? I'm thinking about maybe if I really can't find a color, I will go over and color pick it from that reference photo. But a lot of the time, you will kind of have a good sense of what colors are in a space by just sort of playing around with it and trying to keep your eye on a reference photo, not let that kind of slip away from you. If you find you're not looking back at it every few seconds, Even just looking, even if you don't know what you're looking for, it is quite useful. It just helps you kind of go, okay, am I capturing what I'm going for here? So as I'm doing this, I'm thinking, okay, I have an okay idea of where the light and shadow on his face are, but the light I've chosen is quite warm and the light in the actual photo is quite cool. So I'm going to just go manually pick a nice pale grayish blue color, and not using any blend modes, I'm just going to start bringing that in a little bit. So as I do that, at first it's going to look quite overblown. It's going to look a bit extreme because I'm just putting down these little dashes of this color. But as I go in and I start painting into it with this, again, I'm making my brush a little smaller sometimes, but I'm not zooming in. And by smaller, I mean it's at like size 90. And I'm trying to embrace the fact that the brush will come with its own texture, its own sense of shape and movement, and use that as I think about how I am painting. I'm a little more comfortable with these brushes than you guys will be because they're my brushes. So there'll also be an element of, as you kind of get more comfortable with the tools, you get better at using them in ways that work for you. What works for one person is just not going to be the same as what works for you. So if you have friends or like, you know, you see an artist online, they're doing a different thing, that's their thing. It's useful to try other people's techniques. Sometimes you learn something. Sometimes you can it really helps you understand why you're not achieving in an area you want to achieve in, but they are not necessarily doing something better than you. They're not doing something smarter. They're just doing something that works better for them. So as I'm doing this, I am trying to sort of break down these shapes. I'm trying to sort of merge in the areas of light and dark. I'm trying to, by using this thing where I am clicking every few seconds to pick up the kind of colors that are quite close to what I'm looking at, I am just bringing these in. I'm trying to keep a sense of what the reference photo looks like. And as I'm doing this, maybe I do decide to make some changes. Maybe I decide to, you know, smooth certain shapes out or enhance certain shapes. Maybe I'm going to, you know, change his mouth color or change sort of like certain areas. I'm just going over my lines. My lines are vanishing underneath as I paint. I'm not worrying about is what my line art looks like at all, because right now I don't have line art. I find that line art is something best applied at the end, which is, I think, a different way than a lot of people work. But in saying that, I don't tend to work with line art that much. I tend to do this sort of painterly style. And so like all things, it's very much about finding what approach works for you. So as I'm doing this, I'm really trying to remember what these basic shapes this guy is made up of are and how I can apply them. Sometimes you will work on something and it will simply not look good, even if it is what is in the photograph. So there's also just an element of using your discretion as an artist to see how things best work. So as I'm doing this, you know, I'm kind of getting a general sense of what my guy looks like. I'm not using black or white at any point because those colors pretty much don't exist and they aren't necessary to include. When I'm doing things that are darker, if I'm not color pulling from my own painting, I'm going to go manually choose a darker color on the color picker. Ideally, if I want a dark color, I'm going to pick a dark color that already exists in my palette, and I'm just going to use that. So if I want shadows, I'm going to select some of my nice shadows up here, and I'm going to start bringing them in. This will help the entire work feel really unified. It'll help kind of keep it feeling like it all belongs together. If I want some red colors for his ears, I'm just going to pull those from the red of his nose, things like that. So at this point, maybe I want to go work a little smaller just to help define, say, his eyes or something like that. So ideally, I would still be able to see my reference. I can't. That's fine. But as I do this, I'm going in and I'm just still thinking about these things as being made of these big shapes. So I'm trying to keep the idea of what are the shapes of the eye here. There's sort of a white area, there's a darker area. Okay, how do I maintain that? And then as I'm doing this, I'm constantly going between zooming back out and zooming in, because I need to be looking at my reference, because otherwise I don't know what an eye looks like. And this is something you end up learning, which is you just don't know what anything looks like. I don't want it to be a smart object. Why would it be a smart object? Sometimes you press a button and it just really decides to do something on your computer, by the way, so enjoy. But when I'm doing big shadows, like I want to add some shadows back onto his cheeks, I'm making my brush bigger. And it's always important to, if you can make your brush bigger and still achieve the result, then do it. Particularly when it comes to painting, there's no point in covering a very very large area with a very small brush very painstakingly. You won't achieve a better effect, and you will achieve it slower. And it is really just a disappointment to you by the time you reach the end of that. So I'm also blocking in the shapes of his clothes here. They are super rough, but we are getting an idea of who this guy is. And I can, although I would recommend, not doing this unless you know what your background color is, I'm just going to erase in some parts to help sort of define some of his edges. Again, I can use a smaller brush for some stuff, but I don't want to use it for everything. And I want to make sure that my values are somewhat consistent. So as I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, it's a bit too pale up in this area for him. I'm going through, I'm like, okay, I don't need to have this area of lightness. And so one thing you can do, if you're like, how are my values doing? I have no idea, is make a new layer and just make it grayscale by making it black or white or gray. I'm using the paint bucket tool or the gradient tool for this, and then bring it in the blend modes down to color or saturation. And this lets me look at this in grayscale, so that now I have a layer that I can switch on or off, and it will give me a sense of how my character is working in comparison to the reference tonally. So as I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, cool. Maybe there's some areas where I need to sort of add tone back in. As you can see, I have made some changes from the reference. I've kind of lost his square jaw shape. So if I want to bring that back in, this is a great point to do this. I'm still trying to share these colors around, use the existing colors, use the existing sort of like understanding I have built up of kind of what his colors are, what that means. I'm not just drawing from color picking from the reference, but you can if you are stuck. I'm going to go around and see how you guys are doing. This is going to be quite fast. It's going to be quite ugly. That's completely normal. The idea is that as you do this, you can then start kind of going, okay, new layer. And now I'm going to work in more detail on the eyes or something like that. And you can sort of slowly start digging in further and further with the idea that you stay zoomed out nice and big for as long as you possibly can. You want to have your reference on screen and visible and to be looking at it as long as you can. And whenever necessary, you just want to be able to go big again. A lot of the time, actually zooming out like this and seeing, okay, are my shapes still recognizable? Am I still translating this as intended helps? So as I am zooming out, what I can see is that I've actually made the right-hand cheek a bit too dark. So I go in, I pick up some of these sort of mid colors here, and I'm going to use them to help build up a little bit of the lightness in his cheek. Again, I don't want it to be overpowering, but I just want to not have lost that completely. So as you can see, there is a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of just overpainting. I'm not undoing anything. If I make a line and I don't like it, I paint over it again. It's not everyone's preference, but I find it works well for me, which is what we're here for. So I'm going to come around and just sort of like see how you guys are doing.